The parents of accused ISIS fighter Jihadi Jack, as he's known, are speaking out. They're slamming Conservative leader Andrew Scheer for saying he wouldn't lift a finger to help their son. Jack Letts is currently being held in a Kurdish jail in Syria. Until recently, he was a dual British and Canadian citizen, until the UK revoked his citizenship. Letts' father is Canadian and is calling for the government to bring his son to Canada. John Letts has long supported his son. He and his wife Sally were found guilty of funding terrorism for sending their son money while he was in Syria. Joining me now is John Letts, father of Jack Letts, and he joins me from Oxford to the UK. John Letts, welcome to you.
Hi, Carol.
When was the last time you heard from or about your son?
We haven't spoken to him directly. Well, directly it's been 4 years, but indirectly through messenger apps 2.5 years ago when he was first picked up by the Kurds.
Okay. And what do you know of his condition right now?
I know very little except what people see on these interviews that keep coming out. I mean, journalists seem to be able to access him very easily, presumably after paying a bribe and knocking on the door of his cell, but no lawyers are allowed in. The Red Cross has difficulty communicating with him. We get very rare messages from them, very heavily censored. We can't speak to him. So, and I don't really trust the interviews because I know they're made under duress. I know he's been tortured in his prison.
How do you know? How do you know
I can trust.
I'm sorry. How do you know he's been tortured?
Well, I mean, he's had years of torture. First, he was tortured by ISIS when he was in ISIS territory, but in the prison where he is, a human rights lawyer named Clive Stafford Smith from Reprieve, who's very well respected, is the only person who's actually gone in. He wasn't actually acting as his lawyer, but he's the only person who got in to speak to him. And Jack told him, listen, all that interview, most of that was rubbish. I had to say what I had to say. I've been tortured. You answered the same questions that in the same way when you're asked under torture. He said, I never fought. I was never a terrorist. I wasn't engaged in violence. I've never had a weapon, and I was never a member of ISIS. And Clive said, I believe what he said was absolutely honest. But how do you know? You know, politicians are constantly talking. In your last piece, they talk about due process, the rule of law, human rights. Jack is locked up without charge in a foreign prison, no access to a lawyer, no access to a family. We believe he's been tortured. When I look at him, I can tell there's something very wrong. He's got medical problems. There's a whole pile of issues. There's no due process. And Andrew Scheer says, I think he should stay in the jail where he is. Well, what if Jack is innocent? Has anyone actually considered it? Just because the media repeats this stuff for 5 years and we've been unable to counter it because of contempt of court until now. I mean, what if he is innocent? And I think the 2- and 3-year-old children and a lot of the other people, Canadians, there's only a small handful of them, all detained in these camps. I think they're innocent. What about due process and the rule of law for them? I very much appreciate that there's a risk and a fear. I don't want dangerous people walking the streets of Canada. My family and friends all live there, and I've said it 100 times. If Jack's done something wrong, I will come onto your show and every other program and condemn him publicly for what he does. But I think that the Canadian system can separate between the good and the bad. I think that I trust the democratic process in Canada to deal with that. And if Jack's done something wrong, he should be punished, pay his price. But I think that he can actually contribute because Jack stood against ISIS.
Let me put this to you. Linus Doubtfire posted a picture on Facebook, and this is part of the BBC interview and investigation around the piece on your son, saying he completed his commando artillery course in the British Army. He posted, I would love to perform a martyrdom operation in this scene, and clearly the police believe that he went to the Middle East to join ISIS.
Yeah, and the police also said that my wife and I purposely sent thousands of pounds to Syria to pay suicide bombers to blow up British soldiers. Now, I believe, and Jack has stated, and he stated it to Clive as well, that he was forced to he actually handed over his Facebook password to someone. The account was hacked. He denies that that was his message. And if you look at the English, it certainly wasn't. I mean, the British police might believe that, but that statement was taken apart in court. And so I don't believe that's his statement. The only thing else that remains is this picture of Jack standing on a rock with his finger in the air, using the symbol of Islam, the Tawhid. That's not necessarily the symbol of ISIS, although it might have been co-opted. And then these interviews, which I dismiss as torture. But I just also want to correct one thing you said at the beginning, if I may, Carol. Okay. I know I'm talking so much. It's been a really intense and long few days. But you said that we were charged and found guilty of sending money to Syria to Jack Letts. No, we were found not guilty, actually, on the two main charges of trying to send money to Jack in Syria. The jury accepted that we sent the money under duress because Jack was being hunted by ISIS, that he had opposed them, that he was going to be killed and his life was in danger, and that as parents, we had to act under duress, under pressure to save his life. And in addition, the jury accepted that the police had told us we could send the money. We cooperated with them fully over this whole period.
I understand that. I understand that. But if I may, the most recent information that I have from the BBC is that you had been found guilty of funding terrorism when you sent your son £223 while he was in Syria, despite concerns that he had joined the Islamic State group. Now, there was a lot of goodwill from the judge in this case, saying that you did it out of love for your child, but that you should, as I understand it, should have known that there was a great possibility that this money could have been redirected toward terrorism.
That's a long series of points. I mean, it sometimes comes down to this fine nuance of the wording. We were found guilty on that one charge. That's absolutely right. It was sending £200 British, about $330 Canadian. And of course, they spent 6 million British pounds, so $10 million prosecuting us on that charge. We did, or my wife did send that money. And that was in September before we were charged. They added that onto the charge sheet about a year, 9 months after we were actually charged with those other two offenses. Initially, the police totally ignored that because they said go to Syria. It went to a poor family in Lebanon who were friends of Jack. Nevertheless, Section 17 of the Terrorism Act is very, very tight. The evidential bar, as they say, is incredibly low. And all you need is for the police to say, we think there was theoretically a risk that some of this money might or could have been used for terrorism. The judge then said there is no evidence that any of this money went to terrorism, and it's absolutely the case that these two people did not support terrorism. They acted to try to protect their child. And when that policeman looked at me, Carol, and he said, Mr. Letts, you're in a really difficult position. I understand that. If you don't send this money to help him escape, and the only way out of Syria, of ISIS territory at that point, was people smugglers. He said, if you don't send it, your son will be, crucified or decapitated. It must be really difficult. But on the other hand, in spite of the fact that we told you we could send it 3 days ago, we now think you shouldn't send it because we might arrest you. Now, as a father who loves my son, who believes he's innocent, and has read all these horrible messages from him about condemning ISIS, first of all, and the fear I could feel, I had a choice. Do I break the law, potentially, because they were never clear whether they would arrest us or not, or do I try to save my son's life, who I believe was in imminent danger, and so did the jury? I had to act.
Okay, on the
and
point,
I do it again.
All right, on the point of your son, I understand that. On the point of your son, both Andrew Scheer, to be fair, and the Canadian government seem to agree on this point. The law, experts say the law is clear. Canada has to accept any Canadian citizen who comes to the border by virtue of the fact that they are a Canadian citizen. But what both the Canadian government and the opposition seem to agree on is that they will not help your son get to the border. Take a listen to what our public safety minister, Ralph Goodale, had to say. Take a listen to this.
This individual and others have made the calculated decision to leave the comfortable confines of Canadian democracy, to travel halfway around the world, to associate themselves with the most evil and violent terrorism in several generations. they need to assume the consequences for their responsibility. We will ensure that the law and the Constitution are applied, but we will not facilitate their travel.
What's your reaction to that?
I completely agree that anybody who leaves Canada or any other country to engage in terrorism, to create terror in the world, particularly if they're wearing a Canadian flag, that's a massive insult to me as a Canadian and to all Canadians, and it puts the world in danger. I totally agree. I do not believe, and I want the chance, and I think Jack should have the chance to show that he did not travel there for terrorism. I really don't believe it's the case. And just because the media reports it for 5 years doesn't make it true. So I agree with him. I want safety. I want someone to deal with these terrorists who are out there. The victims need justice. I mean, just leaving them in camps is not going to be safe. I actually don't think 2- and 3-year-old children can be terrorists. And I think a lot of people went to Syria for religious reasons, stupid, naive, you can call them all sorts of things. Had I known he was going, and he didn't even know, he went on a holiday to Jordan. So, and then went to study Arabic language in Kuwait, and something happened. I'd love to know. If he's done something wrong, absolutely, I think he should be punished. But how do you know? How do you know if he's done something wrong? You can't even get a lawyer in. He's not a prisoner, he's a hostage. I keep saying it. He's being held by people who wear balaclavas and pistols. He's been in solitary for a long time. And then a door opens and someone sticks a camera in his face and says, "Are you a traitor or are you a collaborator?" I mean, it's just playing to the camera. Everybody wants to look hard on crime, tough on crime. Why don't we be tough on those dark forces that are kind of destroying democracy and human rights around the world? People who illegal detention of people without charge. I mean, these are Canadian values that I believe in. Okay. I think Jack can contribute to pushing them forward.
All right.
Give him a chance.
John Letts, father of Jack Letts, joining me from Oxford in the UK. John, thank you so much. I know it was a late night for you to do this interview, so I appreciate that.
Thank you very much for having me, Carol. I'm sorry I got a bit worked up.
I understand.